Excitotoxins, the taste that kills. Excitotoxin is a substance added to foods and beverages that literally stimulates neurons to death, causing brain damage of varying degrees. Can be found in such ingredients as monosodium glutamate, aspartame, NutraSweet, cysteine, hydrolyzed protein, and aspartic acid. Citing over 500 scientific studies, Excitotoxins explores the dangers of aspartame, MSG, and other substances added to our food. This is an electrifying and important book.
So this is a universal effect of monosodium glutamate, and these are all serious things. These aren't feeling bad. Too many people associate MSG with the Chinese restaurant syndrome. And I hear people frequently say, oh, well, I don't get that. I'm not sensitive to it. It is not an allergy. It is not a sensitivity. It is a toxin. Everybody's sensitive to a toxin. You're sensitive in various degrees. But what we'll see later is that it produces its effects silently. You pay the price later. And you may not associate it with it because you don't think that something you did or fed your baby or when you were pregnant is going to cause them to have a heart attack when they become 30 or 40 years old. Now, we said the brain is forming all these pathways. So this is just an example of the complexity of these connections. Everything has to be exact. And the brain is constantly, during this period, the last trimester of birth, inside the uterus, and 4 years after birth, the brain is constantly remolding itself to get it just right. Glutamate is important in that process. It's used for that process, but it has to be an exact level. If it's too much, it ruins the connections. If it's too little, it ruins the connections. And these connections are permanently going to be that way. This is a three-dimensional view, so you can see that these connections are three-dimensional. They're not on one plane. They have to be in 3 dimensions connected. It's an incredibly, incredibly complex process. And anyone who doesn't believe in God has seen this. I can't imagine why you don't believe in God, because there's no way for us to explain how this happens. And these pathways go the whole length of the brain, so they have a long way to go, and they have to be connected just so. And glutamate can permanently alter how these connections and pathways are formed and connected. This is the temporal lobe of your brain. You've heard Vicki talk about the hippocampus. It lies right in here, and it has everything to do with your memory. The temporal lobe is very important. We call it the integrative cortex. It connects to all other parts of the brain. It takes everything you've ever seen, done, heard, smelled, and it correlates it. So it's very critical. This is one of the most sensitive areas of the brain to MSG. It's one of the most sensitive areas of the brain to a lack of glucose. This is just the synapses, how the brain cells communicate to each other to show that even that's a very complex process. It's not a simple process either. That is formed when you're a baby as well, and it's a very exacting process. Now, they knew early on that there are certain endocrine changes that occur with exposure to MSG in these animals. One of the most obvious, of course, is the effect on reproduction. And they looked at the different hormones, and they found out that it altered estrogen secretion. It altered the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus, which controls your estrogen cycle.
There you go.
It also had an effect on testosterone for the males, so that while they were exposed as a child, it not only affected the nuclei that control these different hormones to be regulated and released, but it altered the pathways in the hypothalamus that made up the control system. And so when these animals became older, their control system was totally different than a normal animal. And this is what's happened in humans. So that when that child's exposed as a small baby or a toddler, when he becomes adolescent or older and finds they have reproductive problems, they can't have babies, they're infertile, or they have other reproductive problems. They can have trouble with their menstrual periods. They can have polycystic ovaries. So there's all sorts of problems related to hormones that we can trace back to MSG that you normally wouldn't expect. Because when you see the child at age 20 or 25 and they're married and they're having problems having a baby, who would have thought that it was because what that child's mother ate when she was pregnant with the child? But we have good experimental proof that shows it is connected.
Of course it's connected.
We found that even lesser doses, a small dose of MSG, can actually cause an early onset of puberty. Loss of growth hormone pulsation. That little nucleus that the doctor said he didn't think it had any function. Its primary function is the control of growth hormone. That's why all these animals are short, because it suppresses the pulsating release of growth hormone. And of course, we said it can alter the pathways. Now let's look at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus of your brain, if you had to pick a part of your brain that you said was probably the most sensitive to any injury, it'd be the hypothalamus. Doctors kid about it being the seat of the soul. It's about the size of your fingernail on your little finger. It's not very large. But it controls an enormous amount, and you cannot live without a hypothalamus. Major injury to the hypothalamus, you're going to die, short the intervention of the Lord. If we look at the functions of the hypothalamus, we see that it controls all of the endocrine system, or the growth hormone, thyroid hormone, adrenal hormones, cortisol. All of these things are controlled through the hypothalamus. It controls your hunger and satiety. It tells you when you're hungry. It tells you when you need to eat. And this is part of the thought of anorexia nervosa, if they have a problem in the hypothalamus. We know that it controls the autonomic nervous system. We know that it is a major part of what we call the limbic system of the brain. That's the part of the brain that has to do with your emotions. It has to do with love, anger, fear. Is regulated through the hypothalamus. And if you give MSG to animals, you can produce intense fear, or you can produce intense anger. Associated with unprovoked rage, overt aggression, and antisocial behavior. This is almost always consistent in these MSG-exposed babies. And I'm not just talking about while they're a baby. This is when they become adults. Anytime you break down a protein to its free amino acids, you're getting high concentrations of excitotoxins. I don't care what they say. You call the company and they say, no, we don't add excitotoxin, no, we don't have MSG. Yes, they do. They say MSG is a salt of glutamate, monosodium glutamate. It's not the sodium that's causing the problem, it's the glutamate. So if they break down the protein and they have a high concentration of glutamate, no, it's not MSG, but it's glutamate. It's the glutamate that's the excitotoxin. In nature, the way God planned things is that proteins are to be broken down slowly in your system. Then your body utilizes it very slowly and it doesn't build up into your blood or your brain. We weren't meant to eat hydrolyzed, broken down proteins and free amino acids. Our body doesn't know how to handle that. So when you consume monosodium glutamate, your blood levels can reach 20-fold higher than normal. A brain doesn't know how to handle 20-fold higher normal monosodium glutamate. Neither does the liver, the muscles, or the other organ systems. It wasn't designed that way. And let's look at, I'm going to give you something that you're probably going to hate, but this is just the physiology of the excitotoxic process. What goes on in a nerve cell when it's exposed to excitotoxins? But this just gives you kind of an overview. Now first, there are a lot of diseases and disorders that are associated with excitotoxicity, and this list is growing every day. They're finding more and more diseases that have anything to do with the brain is associated with excitotoxicity. It seems to be a central process in a lot of different diseases. And this is what we're finding out throughout medicine, is that there's just simple, central things that are causing a wide spectrum of disease. What makes the difference between one disease and another, whether it's cancer or Alzheimer's disease or arthritis, is the excitotoxicity is producing it in different tissues. We know that head injuries, if you injure your head, what happens is, we've known for some time that most of the damage that happens to your brain in the head injury doesn't happen at the time of the injury. That does happen, but usually not. It's delayed several hours. And we've gone through all kinds of contortion trying to figure out what is this delayed damage and how can we stop it. Well, now they've discovered it's excitotoxicity. Because when your brain is injured, it releases glutamate from itself, because normally glutamate is a transmitter in the brain. It's the most common transmitter in the brain. But it's carefully regulated. When you injure your brain, it can't regulate it anymore, and it builds up a high level in your brain and produces the delayed injury that frequently results in severe neurological injury or death. Strokes. When you have a stroke and a block off a blood vessel that's going to the brain, it isn't the lack of blood supply that causes the worst part of the stroke. That just kills a little tiny core of brain tissue. Around that tiny core, the brain starts secreting enormously large amounts of excitotoxins. And that's what causes the devastating aspect of a stroke. If we block those excitotoxins, the stroke is much less. And you can do that with something that God created called food. Hypoglycemic brain damage. When your blood sugar falls extremely low and people go into a coma or die, it's not because the brain cells are starved for glucose. It's because when they're starved for glucose, they release a lot of glutamate, and the glutamate kills the brain cells. AIDS dementia has recently been shown to be caused by excitotoxicity. Migraine headaches are caused by it. Anytime your nervous system is infected with a virus or bacteria, it causes the brain to secrete large amounts of glutamate, and that's what does the damage. Seizures are caused by glutamate excess, excitotoxicity. Most of your seizure drugs, anti-seizure drugs, block glutamate. All of these different things, degenerative brain disease, Parkinson's, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, the hottest area of research is the death of the brain cells by glutamate. It can cause immune suppression, episodic violence, and learning disorders. Now, if you look at a typical brain cell, you have the cell body, or the main part of the cell, and you have this long process called an axon, and at this end looks like a spiny tree in the winter. This is the dendrite. This is where all the different connections are made in the brain. They connect each other, and dotted on here, you see these little squares here, that's the receptors. That's where glutamate attaches to send the signals down the nerve cell. So glutamate is normal in the brain. It's the most common transmitter, as I said, and its function is to carry information from one brain cell to the next so your brain will work. And it carries out almost everything that you can think of in your brain is somehow connected to glutamate neurotransmitter. Now, this is a neurodegenerative process, and basically this is what is the central process for all those diseases I listed about excitotoxicity. That whole long list, this is what happens. And this is similar to what happens in cancer, surprisingly, and arthritis. We're finding that everything is a central mechanism. But in the brain, there's one little difference, and that has to do with this membrane here. It has a little pore in it, a little opening, a channel. This is microscopic. You can only see that on an electron microscope. And what this does is this little pore opens and closes. And glutamate controls the opening and closing of that little pore. Normally, there's very little glutamate outside of that brain cell. I mean, absolutely minute amounts, in millionths of a mole, okay? And it has to be that way, because if that level rises, it'll kill that brain cell. So your brain goes to a lot of trouble to make sure that glutamate level outside that nerve cell never gets above that 10 to 12 millionths of a mole. And it does that by a process where anytime glutamate's out there, it combines with a special transport protein, and that whisks it away and puts it in a cell called an astrocyte and stores it there until it's needed. Only when you're going to have a transmission of an impulse will it release it, and when it does, it breaks loose of the transport protein, attaches to its receptor, opens up the hole, and calcium pours into your cell. And then it whisked away again, and the hole closes. So it's only open for a millionth of a second, just enough to let a few molecules of calcium in. Once that calcium is in, it starts triggering these processes. And these processes normally, if it's just a little bit of calcium, what it does, it makes the nerve fire its impulse. If something happens and there's too much glutamate, it opens that hole up for too long, too much calcium gets in. If too much calcium gets in, then two too intense of a reaction of these different processes take place, and it'll produce an inflammatory reaction in that cell with these inflammatory chemicals. It'll produce what we call free radicals, which are just very toxic chemicals that bounce around the cell, oxidizing all the components of the cell. One of the components that really damages is what we call the mitochondria. And that's the little part of your cell that produces almost all the energy that you use for everything, whether it's walking, moving, thinking. Mitochondria supplies the energy for everything. These free radicals generated by too much calcium damages that mitochondria, so it can no longer produce its energy the way it's supposed to. If it can't produce enough energy, the cell dies. It activates a gene called a p53 gene, which is the suicide gene in your cell. Cells are pretty smart. God made them that way. If this cell is damaged too bad by all these processes, and the cell knows that it cannot survive, it'll activate that gene and go ahead and kill itself. We call that apoptosis. And that's what too much calcium coming in will do. We also know that some of these products build up, they'll inhibit this transport protein so that more glutamate will start building up. So it's a kind of a cyclic process that just keeps going until the cell dies. Now, note with the knowledge that if too much glutamate out here is toxic, and it doesn't take a lot to make it toxic, does it make a lot of sense to add it to your food? Knowing that it transfers through the blood-brain barrier and will enter the brain, which we have proof of. Now, when we look at excitotoxin sensitivity, three things we see that are very important. One is that human is 5 times more sensitive than the next most sensitive life form on Earth, the mouse. And we're really 20 times more sensitive than a rhesus monkey. Newborn babies are 4 times more sensitive than adults. So if you're pregnant and you're eating food that contains a lot of MSG, that is passed through the placenta into the baby and damages the baby's brain at a time that brain is being formed. And they're 4 times more sensitive than an adult would be. Why are the babies so sensitive to MSG? It's because their brain enzymes that normally protect them are immature. They haven't formed yet. Their blood-brain barrier is immature. It hasn't completely formed yet. And babies and toddlers frequently become hypoglycemic, which magnifies excitotoxicity. Now, what do these excitotoxins do inside of the nervous system once they get in there? Well, we know that they can actually alter how the brain forms. That's what's so bad about the little children. We know that when the mother is pregnant, during that last trimester and during the first 4 years after birth is when most of the brain is forming. All these little pathways have to connect, and they have to connect in a certain way. All these dendrites are growing and branching. These synaptic connections are taking place. And that is very sensitive to glutamate. Too much, it destroys these pathways or make them grow in the wrong direction. We know they can destroy certain groups or collections of these brain cells called these nuclei, like the arcuate nucleus, ventral medial nucleus of the hypothalamus. It can destroy it. This nucleus is the most sensitive area of the entire brain. It was interesting during the hearings on the toxicity of glutamate, one of the neuroscientists that was working for the glutamate producers made the statement, well, so what if it destroys the arcuate nucleus? We don't know whether it does anything or not. But at the time, we knew the arcuate nucleus was a very important nucleus in the brain. It's very vital. Another interesting thing is that less than toxic doses, that is, a dose that won't kill a cell, will alter its physiology. It'll make the cell overreact, so if it's a cell secreting hormones, they'll secrete too much hormone. If it's one that has to do with consciousness, it may cloud the consciousness. If it affects memory and it's overstimulated, it may alter your ability to remember. One of the ways that excitotoxins kill is by producing free radicals. Excitotoxins are very powerful free radical generators. They make these cells produce all these destructive free radicals that destroy the cells. And one of the interesting things we found out not too long ago is that it impairs the ability of glucose to enter the brain. The brain is almost totally dependent on glucose for its energy supply. Glutamate interferes with the entry of that fuel to the brain. So when you're consuming a diet high in MSG, it interferes with the ability of your brain to get the fuel it needs. Now, let's look at the MSG babies. These were the animals that were first exposed to glutamate. They all had certain characteristics that is repeatable, and this has been repeated ever since this first was discovered. This has been done over and over. We find that the organ weights of the animals are very small. It causes atrophy or shrinking of various organs. The ovaries, testes, adrenal glands, kidney, spleen, pituitary, they all are smaller than normal, significantly smaller. We find that the animals were all grossly obese. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but the obesity is similar to what we're seeing in human society now. With this growth, we're talking about adolescent obesity. All the kids are real obese, and it's difficult to control, and a lot of the adults are finding trouble controlling their obesity. We find that it's almost impossible to diet off this type of obesity, and it's almost impossible to exercise at all, because it alters the part of the brain that has to do with obesity.